welcome to Slavery and Its Legacies, a podcast of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Slavery and Its Legacies interviews visiting scholars, activists, and others about their contributions to the understanding of slavery, past and present, and its ongoing role in the development of the modern world.
Hello, this is Thomas Thurston, and today I'm speaking with Westenley Alcenat, who is an assistant professor of history and American studies at Fordham University. He got his PhD just a year ago from Columbia University and received his BA in political science and history from Macalester College in Minnesota. And it's great having you here. It's great having you at the center. We were talking on the way back. I've known Wes since he was an undergrad, just because, you know.
Since my sophomore year, when I first made was my first trip out east, actually, from the Midwest. I had never been out east before, and I visited the Beinecke Library here at Yale.
That's
and
right.
My undergraduate advisor had put me in touch with you as someone he said I absolutely had to visit and sit with. And I remember we had lunch sitting at some stoop near the Beinecke Library.
That's right.
Yes. And I remember how informal it was.
The lunch trucks are great around here.
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
really no reason
exactly.
to eat anyplace else.
Yes, and it was one of the first times I ever ate sort of from a food truck.
Uh-huh.
Because, we don't really have those in Minneapolis. Maybe now we do.
Yeah, I bet you do.
But also, I just had come out of a meeting with the then, I forgot his name, but he's now at Northwestern.
John.
Yes.
Yes.
He's a provost at Northwestern.
Provost at Northwestern.
Yes.
John
John Holloway.
Holloway.
John Holloway. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. So that was refreshing to go from that to sort of very more informal setting.
Right. Right. And I was very impressed that an undergraduate, just like even a sophomore, for summer vacation was doing a grand tour of the research libraries on the East Coast. I was like, I should be seeing him again soon. At any rate, you're working. You're here. You're working on your book project,
Yes.
which is "Children of Africa Shall Be Haitians: Prince Saunders, Revolutionary Transnationalism, and the Foundations of Black Immigration." It's really a interesting project that is rethinking the origins of transatlantic abolitionism and kind of reconceptualizing Black nationalism.
Yes.
And also in a way just looking at immigration movements to Haiti. And honestly, I like it if you could start there just to give people a sense. I should add that the kind of end of this tagline is, I think I cut it off, but it's I think it's 1815 to 1865.
1815 to 1865.
So tell us what's happening in a larger sense as far as are there waves of African Americans that are leaving and going to Haiti, which is
So the project, really, in terms of looking at the immigration years, is 1815 to 1865. But because I will be looking at the immigration project through the life of this one individual, Prince Saunders, who was among the pioneers of it.
Right.
It really starts at 1775, the time he was born, in revolutionary Connecticut. But if we start at 1815, around that time, up until the 1820s, there will be a wave of African Americans who immigrated to Haiti. So this will have been roughly a decade and a half after Haiti consolidated itself into a nation state as the first Black republic. And roughly, as historians have estimated, about 13,000 people by the 1820s had immigrated to Haiti, which was a huge number, given that it wouldn't be until the late 1860s that the American Colonization Society will have succeeded in settling as many people in the west coast of Africa, Liberia, as as the ones who immigrated to Haiti in terms of large numbers. So, so this is by far not sort of a small story.
Right, and especially considering that the population, the free black community is not all that big.
Exactly.
So this is a huge amount. And so what is kind of pushing and pulling them to make this this
That's a great question. The fact that you labeled it as pulling and pushing it shows that there's two sides to the story. So on the one hand, there's the pull factor, which the idea of Haiti as a revolutionary republic established by free black people who had initially just become triumphant over British, Spanish, and French imperialism to gain their independence. So that in itself is attractive as a pull factor. But even more importantly, few people remember that Haiti actually lost almost half of its population through the revolution. So there was also an active need to repopulate the population, especially gaining families and men of who could do the labor as well as.
So they're calling
defend.
people.
So
They're looking for immigrants.
Yeah, they're looking for immigrants, black immigrants especially,
Yeah.
and as early as 1805 or 1806. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, one of the earliest revolutionaries and leaders of the country, made a call out to fugitives, people who had either left the island during the revolution or fugitives anywhere, who would be interested in coming back to Haiti, and even offered to pay some slaveholders to repatriate the people back to the island, not to necessarily purchase them as enslaved people, but have them have a home, a place where they can come to and use and reincorporate them into this sort of new nation project.
And can I ask, out of curiosity, how do historians arrive at the numbers? Are there records in Haiti as well as in Philadelphia and other places?
Yeah. So the records in terms of Haiti are spotty, right?
Okay.
And to some extent, I still have to do more research on the Haitian side. But on the side of the states, you can look through ship logs, which will give you a sense of.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Often they're enumerated as head of household, and then under that it will tell you how many within a family have moved. And at other times you will have, so there's that, and then you will have publications from the Haitian government that were distributed around to different families and different groups of people through the mid-Atlantic states and New England. And it will say, we want 200 people. All right, so these numbers could be used as estimates. All other numbers come by way of, you will find either an advertisement or just a news clip from, say, the New York Times in the early 1860s, for instance, that says a ship left today at the Boston Harbor with 100 immigrants heading for Port-au-Prince at the invitation of the Haitian government. So putting a composite of these different sources together, historians have estimated roughly how many people left. Yeah.
And are they, when you say like 100 immigrants, is this like maybe the AME Church kind of puts out a call, and so there are a number of families kind of join together, and maybe they kind of know each other to begin with? Okay.
So sometimes it would be a church that organizes the parting families that will be eventually getting on board. Other times it's the Haitian Immigration Society. So there was a Haitian Immigration Society that was formed by James Redpath at about 1859, I believe, so right on the cusp of the Civil War. And Henry Highland Garnet actually had been one of their agents. So they would take tours around different cities and ask people and recruit families to make that trip. Or at other moments, what you would have is you'll have a document from the Haitian government that said we had received this number of people. And then there are cases also of people getting certificate of marriages
Sure.
And then from that, you can see if you can track the families, how many kids have they had, or how many kids did they bring with them from wherever they left. But so this is technically how you would gather some of these numbers.
And does this group, do they immigrate and stay?
No. So it's the immigration project. If you're looking at it from the perspective of whether people settled, for the most part, it appears to have been what some would call a failure, right? About half of the families or half of the people that initially settled, of the estimated 13,000, some 6,000 came back. So about half of people returned to the States. For that reason, many historians look at it as a failed project, that people didn't initially settle as much as they had hoped. But we also should take note of the fact that there were communities that settled. For instance, currently there is a community in the Dominican Republic in Samana, where there is a current population of Afro-Dominicans who are descendants of African-American immigrants to Haiti. And to clear out for some of our listeners why that is the case, why you'll find them on the side of the DR. At the time that people immigrated to Haiti, the island had been united under one republic, under the Haitian Republic. So that when they went, there were different cities designated by the government for where people would settle. And that community in Samana remains one of the most active ones that we have.
Have you had a chance to visit there?
No, but as part of my project, before completing the manuscript, I intend to go there. And I would like to, do a brief oral sort of overview of the area and speak to the people.
Now, and as you said, a lot of historians kind of count it as a kind of a failure because of the number who returned. But, I think the way that you construct Black nationalism kind of puts that's not necessarily the rationale that you're looking at to judge success and failure. And like many of us, when we hear Black nationalism, it's from people who are talking about it as kind of a means of racial separation, own communities, own businesses, that sort of thing. So you think about continuing to this very day, and that's how it's kind of narrowly defined. I think that you have taken that concept and really turned it on its head.
Yes. And for a long time, even when I was younger, reading the works of James Baldwin or Richard Wright or W.E.B. Du Bois and others, I had never been convinced that Black nationalism, for the most part, was driven by this idea of racial separatism. Now, that's one variant of Black nationalism, but an equally important one, which I think has been the most sort of driven part of the ideology, is to sort of assert a sense of self-determination, economic independence from the larger structural dependency of conditions created by white supremacy, as well as just assert a form of citizenship that allows Black people to see themselves as equal makers in whatever societies that they're in. And that's without trying to take history from the past and make it into something, a direct line to the present. You will find that trend of Black nationalism to be inexistent, even as if you listen to Malcolm X speak about his ideology of Black nationalism in his The Ballad or the Bullet speech. It's about self-determination, having political control of one's community, and in his word, one can never really be a full citizen if you're a second-class citizen. It's either you're a full citizen or you're not. And that same ideology, you can take it and transplant it to the 19th century from the intellectual lineage of this person who I'm exploring, Prince Saunders, and you will see the very same ideals here. We are attracted to Haiti because here you have a country that is in the project of establishing self-determination for Black people, is asserting itself as equals to Europeans, and is doing all those things at a time of widespread slavery and racism. And so the project here is not for them to necessarily go to Haiti to separate from the U.S. as like separating from them from
Right.
whiteness, but seeking a society in which racism and white supremacy does not condition citizenship.
You could be fully realized.
Fully realized.
Yeah.
And in the process, let that serve as a lesson to the U.S. So as you were pointing out, if you're looking at this part of the immigration project, success or failure
Right.
does not explain.
Right. You come back from there having a whole set of tools.
Exactly. Tools that otherwise you would not have found
Yeah.
in the United States.
Right.
So from that perspective, it turns the whole idea that immigration was about separating, and in that separation, the whole project failed because they didn't find in Haiti
Yeah.
what they were looking
Yeah.
for. And one of the problems with that sort of construction of immigration is it also turns the narrative back to blaming Haiti, as is often the case in the historiography, right?
Right.
Well, this is just an uncivilized place, a place where the project of republicanism never actually amounted to much, and therefore African Americans went and found what
Right.
everyone knew they would find in
Yeah.
the first place.
They were starry-eyed idealists whose
Yes.
dreams were crushed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I find to be incredibly dismissive in some
Right,
ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So, yes, let's talk about Prince Saunders. He's a Connecticut
Yes.
Connecticut man, I have to say.
Yeah.
So,
Prince Saunders is just an incredibly fascinating and mysterious individual
Yeah.
who was born enslaved in New London, Connecticut, to a father who himself had been a soldier, a black soldier, enslaved, by the way,
Right.
in the Revolutionary Army, and served as a doctor, as one of the earliest members of the Surgeon Corps
Wow.
for the Revolutionary Army, what eventually gave birth to the institution of the Surgeon General. He was one of the antecedents to that corps of members in the service, and his mother Phyllis Saunders was herself also enslaved, and by the Hinckley family, which was a very prosperous and wealthy family of colonists who had owned land between Vermont, New York, Connecticut, and together. How the two found each other, I'm not sure, but
Right.
both the mom and the father had been captured from West Africa. So they were of that generation of Africans enslaved in the Americas. So in that family, he was the first African American,
Wow.
and somehow they managed to get him out of Connecticut because slavery would not be abolished in Connecticut for another 2 decades at
Yeah.
least. Sent him to Vermont where slavery had been abolished. The first place in the New World to have abolished slavery in 1777. There are some caveats, of course, but there, through the family of his mother's owners, the slaveholders who had owned his family, gave him an education by way of the Moores Charity School, which was the precursor to what we know as Dartmouth College today. In fact, the money that was set aside for the Moores Charity School, which was primarily for Black and Native American children, but especially Native American children, was diverted away from that purpose and funded what we know today to be Dartmouth College. So
A little reparations due there.
exactly, there is a case for reparations here,
Yeah.
and a very well documented one. Because in fact, where the money was coming from, or some England families, some very wealthy English families,
Wow.
who had been promoting the cause of Native American education, and they were very upset to have learned that the money is being used by Wheelock, who is the founder.
To create a racially segregated
segregated school for mainly white male,
Right.
White boys. So
Yeah.
that certainly caused conflict between him. And in fact, the money had been raised by Simpson Occom, I believe is his name, who had been educated by Wheelock and was one of the earliest sort of students of the charity school. And he himself was very upset that for all his labor of traveling throughout the UK to get this money, and now it was being diverted in a different fashion. So Prince Saunders' life is touching base to all these
Yeah, you've
realm
just
and
named
these
like
ideas.
like 3 or 4
Yeah,
big names.
yeah,
It's
and
like
then
kind of
yeah.
like
So this is the individual who ultimately left Connecticut, left Dartmouth, got to Boston through connections that he made via Wheelock. And once he arrived in Boston, there encountered a successful group of early Black anti-slavery associates who themselves were in connection with English early anti-slavery activists
Right.
who funded many of their activities. And initially, he would come into contact with Paul Coffey.
Yeah, another
Very successful,
right.
very wealthy.
And an emigrationist.
And an emigrationist, perhaps the father of emigrationists. So Coffey was among his earliest mentors. And in fact, he became, in addition to Coffey, became an associate of Prince Hall, who started the first Black Masons, and served as secretary for the Masons. And from there, that's when really everything sort of opened up in terms of his world, having to travel on behalf of the Masons between England and here in the U.S. That then created a connection with British abolitionists who had been in contact with Haiti. And from there, they sent him to Haiti to explore possibilities and ideas of education, of establishing a system of education primarily on the English language.
So he originally comes to Haiti not with the intent of kind of creating like an emigration movement, but to do educational work.
Yeah, to do
kind of-
educational work primarily, because he himself had already been an educator. Among the earliest Black educators in Boston, in part helped start the Abiel Smith School, which was for free Black children in the city. Was able to raise money from white philanthropists. So he already had a career of being very successful in establishing institutions, especially around education to educate Black children. So that, by way of his reputation, really in part helped convince these British anti-slavery activists to make the connection between him and King Henry Christophe, who started a kingdom in northern Haiti. And Christophe was an Anglophile who also hated France very much, so wanted to turn the country's attention away from the French language and much more towards British culture. So he was very inviting of the idea of an Anglo-African, if you will, an Anglo-African American in connection with British roots,
and having
British
to
connections.
kind of revamp the educational system if you're going to turn it to a kind of Anglophone.
Exactly. And through that, Saunders started developing the idea of, besides me, we could also recruit other African-American educators, especially free African-Americans who would have had already more resources with regards to education and a background in teaching. So then really it was more to do educational work, and that transitioned to larger immigration stuff.
And let me ask, so what's Prince Saunders, like religious affiliation? That matters.
That matters very much.
Yeah.
That matters very much. He would have been raised a Congregationalist. Because of his roots from
New England,
Connecticut. From New England. And then as he got more in touch with, especially Bishop Richard Allen, and others, Paul Coffey and such, he became much more of an AME individual. And through that, I think that opened up many connections with missionary societies who were already looking into some of these places. And
so he has a network that kind of built around those kind of connections.
I mean, that's a great question, because that's another set of network. Basically, what we're uncovering here is an individual who sits at the crux of so many different networks. You have English Masons as well as African American Masons, as well as Haitian Masons. He's in touch with. He's in touch with politicians such as John Quincy Adams, and the entire Adams family. And he's also in touch with British scientists, as well as British Quakers, who are all interested in the same question of anti-slavery, abolition, and propping up Haitian independence as a model for what is possible. And so he's sitting at the middle of all of those, as well as New England educators and very elite institutions. So he's making use of all these different networks to try to turn the attention towards Haiti, and in line with this idea of Black nationalism that we were talking about.
Right. And how does that how is that kind of more energetic kind of notion of Black nationalism, is that reflected in the work that Prince Saunders is doing?
Yeah, so the way I believe it's reflected in the work that he's doing is, for instance, he would often take tours around the states, whether that's New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and a common refrain was to use active documents that were being developed in the Haitian government to around fortifying the political economy, differentiating different labor systems, laws of citizenship, how to organize the family. So these documents for him was a testimony to an ongoing project of self-determination, as well as evidence of Black people being able to perform self-governance. So while it was very much directed to proving their own capability to themselves, there was also a performance of we need to show the world what Black people are capable of. And in order to do that, we have to prop up Haiti as the first symbol that already is making progress towards that by way of the revolution. So that's one way you could see sort of Black nationalism taking shape in his ideology, as well as what he thought or believed immigration would eventually do.
Right, and there is, this kind of, in the Black community, this antebellum civil rights movement, essentially, that is pushing for all the kind of usual things, public accommodations, the right to vote, the right to, all these kind of basic rights that they're struggling for there, but that maybe Haiti can be the place to fully realize those.
Yeah, exactly. And often, sometimes what I like to tell people, and again, it gets us back to this question of how are you measuring success and failure. Yes, people did not, the settlement aspect here did not take place in the way some people had imagined. But if you look at immediately in the post-Civil War era, what are people doing during Reconstruction? They're reasserting their civil rights to citizenship, their political rights to serve in government, as well as making demands on the very land that they had been working for generations. All those issues are being worked out in terms of their vision of what Haiti is or what Haiti was supposed to do for them. So the very questions that led them to look at Haiti, to move towards Haiti, are the very same questions that will be picked up through the Civil War era as well as in the post-Civil War era. So here we're talking about, as you were saying, this immigration movement is part and parcel to that early civil rights movement that's happening in the antebellum period.
Now, so Prince Saunders arrives in Haiti in
roughly 1815, 1816. Yes,
and he dies in the late.
He died in 1839.
Okay.
In Haiti. Yes.
And how, how would he have looked back and assessed his life? Do you think? I mean, in 1838, 1839, has he achieved the kind of things that he set out to do? Has he built a thriving community and an educational system?
I think the most direct way to answer that question is to assess what some African Americans themselves are saying about his legacy.
Okay.
So you look at a few different newspaper clips, and the first thing people remarked on is Prince Saunders died today, one of the most successful men of color to have lived or to have worked on behalf of African American rights and labor. I'm paraphrasing here.
Right.
So that's one measure of his legacy, right? If you hear it exactly from the horse's mouth, what are people contemporaries saying? So that's immediately the reaction to his death. Also, if you look across the Atlantic in London, by 1840, so he died in 1839. In 1840, you have the World Anti-Slavery Convention happening.
Sure.
And some of the
Right.
headliners are Thomas Clarkson,
Yeah.
friends of Prince Saunders, by the way.
Uh-huh.
So to me, that's all testimony of part of the larger legacy that he was building. And right before the Civil War, as well as a bit after Reconstruction became sort of a tragic era, people then looked towards Haiti again.
Right.
So I think he had sparked enough of an interest as to what Haiti means to the project of Black nationalism on a transnational as well as transatlantic level that people kept entertaining the idea as well as making moves towards it up until the 1870s.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the legacy. And in Haiti itself, there, had King Henry Christophe not died, there were clear indications that a full English-based public education system was being developed. A couple higher education institutions had been established, partly under his supervision because he served as Minister of Education, and many more children were going to school there. And you also had an active incoming of British teachers who were helping in the process. And with regards to his position as Minister of Health,
Right.
he also introduced vaccination to Haiti.
Wow.
By way of his association with, British practitioners. So there's that legacy on top of that. So there's, I think if he were to sort of have an opportunity to see what he had been working for,
Right.
he would have seen some success. Now, where I think he might have questioned himself is whether he took too much of an Anglophilic approach to what was necessarily a Francophile society.
Right.
But that's not of Saunders' own problem alone. The king himself was an Anglophile.
Right, he's the one who-
Yeah, so...
Yeah. I usually don't ask people about their work, but this has a personal dimension to you.
Yes, very much so.
Say a little?
I discovered Prince Saunders while an undergrad, really, working at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And one of the librarians, one of the archivists, asked me if I had ever seen this book before called The Haitian Papers, which Saunders published. And looking into him, his biography, I found very interesting. Here is this person who is African American, but lived most of his life in Haiti. Not most of his life, but at least half of his life in Haiti. Served in 3 different government positions. Fully took on Haitian citizenship, while at the same time never separating himself from the States, still living transnationally between the 2 places, and fighting for civil and political rights on both sides from a position that connects the 2 struggles of people of African descent. And for me, as a young, impressionable person at this moment, it really looked as if it mapped onto sort of my experience of living transnationally. What I mean by that is I'm Haitian born,
Right,
but most of my formative years happened in Minnesota, Minneapolis, and a lot of my heroes or people who I look to are African Americans, right, and the struggle for me of what African Americans are fighting for in the states um, are very much connected to what the Haitian Revolution was trying to fight against also. So seeing someone who's connecting and bridging worlds was very appealing to me
Right,
in
and
some ways.
yeah, that's like another term that you use a lot is this notion of revolutionary transnationalism, and I think that what you say kind of sums up this for a whole diasporic community,
Yeah,
Atlantic community.
yeah. So for me, you know, scholars often talk about the ideology of the Haitian Revolution itself. So, moving towards a world where um, democratic and egalitarian citizenship is afforded to all Black people. And in fact, as I often sort of repeat, the the Haitian revolutionaries required everyone to first declare themselves Black in order to attain Haitian citizenship. And I like to sort of put that in the context of today's wording with Black Lives Matter. If you misconstrue Black Lives Matter, you think it's only talking about Black people. But what, in essence, is saying is a society that is able to take care of the most despised, the most denigrated, those people who have never known justice or freedom, once those people become the definition of what freedom, justice, equality, and liberty is, then everyone else can equally enjoy those benefits. So Haiti made it that one has to declare oneself Black, and automatically also gives citizenship to people of African descent as well as Native American. So what I argue with revolutionary transnationalism, once that Haitian revolutionary ideology is taken and put to work on a global scale, as Prince Saunders tried to do by connecting African Americans to that heritage, now you have a project that is no longer just national, it's transnational. And when you have the British abolitionists and socialites supporting that project actively, even through their own government, then you have something that is transatlantic, right? So that for African Americans, it was a Black nationalist project as well as just a project around reinventing citizenship away from white supremacy. And for the British abolitionists, this was an opportunity to showcase and experiment to those who had been speaking against abolition.
Right.
So it becomes global in that sense. So therefore, why I phrase it as revolutionary transnationalism.
Well, Wes, it's been great talking to you, and I'm really excited about this project of yours and the book that's coming out of it, because Prince Saunders, not a lot of people know about him, and it's going to be really exciting to see this out and see him getting the kind of attention he deserves at a time like this.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom.
As always, the Gilder Lehrman Center welcomes contributions from those who support our work and mission. To give, please go to glc.yale.edu and click on Donate, or email the Gilder Lehrman Center for more information.